I want to begin with a question, and if you're watching this in a group, you may be watching this on YouTube or watching it in a group. My real design of these videos is that you watch them with some friends. Most churches have some kind of group structure, and you could watch them in that group structure. Maybe you want to just gather a few friends together on your own. And if you do that, I want you to start with a question, and that is, what are some of your all-time favorite Bible verses? Would you pause the video and talk about that for just a second? Well, I want to make a big prediction, and my prediction is that one of the verses that one of you talk about was this verse right here. And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. Did I happen to guess right? Did some of you quote that verse as one of your favorite verses? My God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. And if you were to ask the question, what is a biblical story? What is a biblical story that illustrates this truth? I think you might turn to the story that we're going to look at today. So we want to look at today's story with the view to asking the question, what do we learn about how God will meet all our needs? Or to look at it a different way, we could look at it as what to do when your brook dries up. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, we look at where Tishbe is here over in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We'll come back to that video or that graphic again and again. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except my word. And just by the way, you might be thinking, boy, he was something else. This Elijah was something else, being able to pray for no rain, and it didn't rain. But James points out that he was a man just like us, and we can expect answers to prayers as Elijah expected answers to prayer. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan. That's back out to it near his home country out there. You can see it again on a map. You will drink from the brook. I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. The original heavenly DoorDash where these ravens brought him some food. So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine east of the Jordan, and he stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. And again, you see this now in the upper center part of the screen. You see more or less 100 miles, a pretty good journey he went up there. When you look at ancient Israel, you need to think about the fact that it's about 150 miles north to south, about half that east to west. And so when you're looking at those locations, it's not going to be 500 miles, and it's probably not going to be 10 miles. It's going to be somewhere in that range that we've talked about. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks, presumably to fix her last meal, as we'll see in just a moment. He called to her and he asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so that I may have something to drink? And as she was going to get it, he called, oh yeah, and one more thing, please bring me a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. What a sad scene here, but she's probably been thinking about this for some time and planning for the idea that this is her last meal, and she's thought about how she could get another meal and can't work out how to do it. And so she reckons that this will be her very last meal. Her brook has run dry. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as I have said. But wait, first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and for your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, the classic Old Testament version of my God will supply all your needs. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. She went away and did as Elijah told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. The jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken to Elijah. So what do we learn from this passage? First thing we learn is God uses nobodies from nowhere. And if you're following along and you watched last week's video, you might be saying to yourself, that sounds a little bit familiar to you. And I want to talk to you for just a second about my philosophy of teaching, my philosophy of instructing you in these videos. I actually called, or a guy called me the last week talking to me about kind of my philosophy of curriculum and what to study and so on. And he said, I got a bunch of teachers. He said, my preacher preaches verse by verse, word by word, going through every word and every tense of every Greek verb and so on. And so consequently, our teachers kind of like that approach. And there's no curriculum that we can find that goes slow enough in that way. And I thought immediately of Lifeway's Explore the Bible series, which goes through the whole Bible in about 9 years. And as I expected, he said, well, that's too fast for us, because if you're going through the Bible in 9 years, you're going to go through, for example, the book of John in 2 semesters, six months. And if you go through the book of John in 6 months, you're going to leave a lot on the table. And he said, our teachers, they want to go through every word, and every verse, and every verb, and every verb tense, and so on. And we want to go deep. And that sounds really good. And you might be wanting that, and you might wonder why I don't do that kind of teaching. And here's why. If you do that kind of teaching, it's going to take you years to go through the book of John, which means that you are never going to get around to the book of Psalms, or you're never going to get around to the minor prophets, or you're never going to get around to the book of Genesis, or you're never going to get around to something if you go that slowly. And to me, there's something in studying the Bible about the idea of going deep enough that we can get what's really here, but at the same time, we want to kind of skip around and teach the whole counsel of God. And my goal is not that we would go through every word and every verse. My goal is summarized in this verse right here. And I will make every effort. I'm going to try to make every effort as I teach to see that after my departure, I'm not going to be able to do this forever. I'm going to do it for a while, but after my departure, you will always be able to remember these things. In fact, I'd say it this way, that you would easily and effortlessly be able to remember these things. And in order to do that, Peter tells us how to do that. Backing up a couple of verses, it says, so, because my goal is that I want you always to be able to remember these things, I will remind you of these things, even though you know them are firmly established in the truth you now have. I think it is right to refresh your memory as long as I live in the tent of this body. And indeed, we talked about this last week. And one of the things that I try to do is try to review often enough so that you do not have to struggle to remember essentially what I want to teach you, and that is how to live the Christian life, that it comes to you automatically and effortlessly. And yes, we did talk about this last week, and I want to repeat it again. God often uses nobodies from nowhere, and God can use you even though you might perceive yourself as a nobody from nowhere. Stumble across this quote, and it's actually been quoted from another number of people, but I'm quoting it from Max Lucado here. In other words, he's quoting it from somebody else. God doesn't call the qualified. God does not call the skilled. God does not call the famous. God does not necessarily call the educated. God does not call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Don't let Satan convince you otherwise. He will try. Satan will try. He will tell you that God has an IQ requirement or an entry fee. You have to be a certain amount of wealth in order to serve God, that he employs in only specialists and experts, governments and high-powered officials. When Satan whispers such lies, and he will, dismiss those with this truth. God stampeded the first century society with swaybacks, classic Max Lucado word picture, with swaybacks, not thoroughbreds. Their collars were blue, their hands were calloused, and there is no evidence that Jesus chose them because they were smarter or nicer or more clever or more talented than the next guy. The one thing they had going for them was their willingness to take a step when Jesus said, "Follow me." Are you more dingy than cruise ship, more stand in than movie star, more plumber than executive, more blue jeans than blue bloods? Congratulations. God changes the worlds with folks like you, as he did in this story, using a nobody from nowhere. Observation number 2, your river will run dry. We read in verse 7 that Elijah's brook run dry, and I want to say to you, your river will run dry. Do you know this verse? In this world you will have. I tell you, when I taught that, when I taught this Sunday to my group, everybody spoke up. I think nearly everybody spoke up and said, "In this world you will have," and the next word is trouble. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, and sooner or later your heart's going to be broken. Sooner or later you're going to run out. Sooner or later your river is going to run dry. There are 2 places in the Bible where there's a 400-year gap in the timeline. One is between Malachi and Matthew, that is between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The other is roughly between Genesis and Exodus. And I say roughly because it is exactly at this verse right here, Exodus 1, beginning in verse 6. Now Joseph and all his brothers and that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled for them and my filled with them, excuse me. And my question is, how many years are spoken of in this verse? And the correct answer is about 400 years. 400 years later, we read this verse, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. And everything went south about that time. Adrian Rogers says God took Elijah down to the brook and fed Elijah there and fed him with the ravens. And he was there at the brook. The brook supplied his water. And yet there came a time of drought and the brook dried up. Maybe your brook is dried up. You lost your job. And you might say, the devil did this to me. And maybe the devil did do it to you, but it could be that God dried up your brook. As a matter of fact, we know that the brook dried up because of Elijah's prayer. He was praying that God would judge the land, and God did judge that land, but Elijah got caught up in that. You see, God dried up the brook. That is, God disturbed Elijah's life because he had something higher and greater and more wonderful for him. God just has a way of stirring our nest, and it'll happen in our life that our brook will dry up. Observation number 3, when the brook does dry up, do something different. Now, he did something different specifically because God told him to. He went to Zarephath. But the broader biblical principle we see is that when your brook dries up, do something different. You see, God has said, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. And if you keep doing what you've been doing and getting a dried brook, you will keep getting, you know what comes next? If you keep doing what you've been doing, you will keep getting I hope you can finish that, what you've been getting. And insanity is doing, can you finish that one? Insanity is doing the same things, expecting different results. And I like to pound away on this truth because I believe it is true of churches, that churches, generally speaking, here in America, it's not true in the Philippines where I grew up, it's not true in many places around the world. But here in America, we are generally speaking not getting the results we want. We are not corporately obedient to the command of God to make disciples of all nations or to make disciples of our nations, in our nation, excuse me. And if that is true, what we need to do is do something different. If you are not getting the result you want to get in your life personally or in your church, let's do something different. My 3-year plan, we are in year 2 and right now. We just started the second week this week. Is 3 years in a row. We plan to spend 6 or 8 weeks learning about evangelism. If we want to do something different, we want to learn to think differently. And so we're going to do it in prime time, not on Tuesday night, but on Sunday morning. We're going to study evangelism. We're going to do it for about 6 or 8 weeks. Last year, we studied the Blessed book. This year, we're studying how to talk about Jesus without being that guy. And we're going to learn how to do things differently. And truth be told, I'm humble enough to say it may not work. But the point is, I think every church, if you're not getting the results you want to get, we ought to do something different, as Elijah does in this story. Brian Tracy, not a Christian by the way, says, I learned the iron law of the universe, which made up getting to the top 20% possible. It is the law of cause and effect, or the law of sowing and reaping. The law says for every effect, there is a specific cause or a series of causes. The law says that if you want to achieve success in any area, if you want your church to grow, if you want to reach the lost, and you're not now reaching the lost, the law of sowing and reaping says we got to do something different if we're going to get something different. You must determine how success is achieved in that area and then practice those skills and activities repeatedly until you achieve the same results. Here's the rule. If you do what other successful people do over and over again, nothing can stop you eventually from enjoying the same rewards as they do. But if you don't do what successful people do, nothing can help you. The law of sowing and reaping from the Old Testament, and doesn't surprise me. I don't know that Brian Tracy is a Christian, and so I'm not surprised that he wouldn't get this reference wrong. It does surprise me a little bit that his editors did not get it right. It's not from the Old Testament. Where was it from a minute ago? It's from the book of Galatians, but he says Old Testament. It is a variation of the law of cause and effect, which says, whatever a man soweth, whenever a man sows, he will also reap. Brian Tracy calls it the iron law of the universe. And if you want to get different results, if your brook dries up, do something different. Fourth observation, God works through people. As he worked through this widow from Zarephath here, he will work through people. And sometimes we just want God to zap us. from the local search and rescue team, and had a search last week, a successful mission last week. And this young man, 21 years old, was out hiking. This particular part of the hike was a loop, and he got to a certain point, and he missed it. It missed a turn, and he kept going. And Las Cruces, home is that way on my little map here, and he hit a cliff, and he didn't know what to do. And I will say he had the good sense. That's really what I want to say about him. He had the good sense to call 911 and ask for help. Now, we don't want you asking for help every stupid thing that comes along. As much as possible, you want to take responsibility for your own life. But sooner or later, for many of us, our brook runs dry and we need to ask for help. And Elijah illustrates the idea that sometimes you need to ask others for help, as this man was humble enough to do. You know, us men, sometimes we don't want to ask for help. We don't want to ask for directions, and don't want to ask anybody to help us. But sometimes we need to ask somebody else to help us. Fifth observation from this story: God is never late, but he is seldom early. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not be run dry, but it's going to nearly run dry, and it's going to nearly be used up. And this is how God often works. Over and over, the Bible repeats these words: wait for the Lord, wait for God to act, wait for him to do what no one else can do in your situation. This kind of waiting doesn't mean drumming your fingers on the table while you accuse God of being slow. Instead, it means take courage, you take heart, because all the time you're waiting, in your heart of hearts, you truly believe, you truly trust that he will act in his time. God is seldom early, but he is never late, says my husband. In fact, he says it so often they'll probably chisel it on his tombstone someday. Some principles remain unchanged. Anyone who has ever lost a job or sensed a true sacrifice in giving to God's work has felt the tension of faith required in the sabbatical year. Faith involves trust, and trust implies risk, or at least risk from our point of view. While God is never late, he is also seldom early, and we will fully expect that to be the case. Observation number 6, faith shows itself in action. He told this woman to take action by first making a small loaf of bread for me, and faith shows itself in action. She went away and did. She went away and took action, and we need to be people of action. James said, in the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. Henry Blackaby and others say, when God invites you to be involved in his activity, he wants to reveal himself to you and to a watching world. Therefore, he will give you a God-sized assignment. In fact, I would argue he's already given you and me a God-sized assignment, and our assignment is make disciples of all nations for your church. And I remind you, he gave that great commission to a group of 12 people or 11 people. Go, you 11 people, go and make disciples of all nations. And you may feel like your church is a little church, a little group of people out in the middle of nowhere, as my church is. And your God-given assignment, your God-sized assignment, is to make disciples of all nations. When you are confronted with such a task, you'll face a crisis of belief. You'll have to decide what you really believe about the God who called you, and the way you respond to God will reveal what you believe. The way you respond to God, what you do, will reveal what you really believe, regardless of what you say you believe. Following God requires faith and action. I want to say I would put that a little bit differently. I would say following God requires faith. It requires faith, and it requires faith alone. But the faith that it requires is never alone, to quote Luther. That is, it requires a faith that always shows itself in action. Without faith, you cannot please God, Hebrews 11:6, and without action, your faith is dead, just as we looked at in James 2:26 a moment ago. So what have we seen? God uses nobodies from nowhere. The river, your brook will run dry. When the brook does run dry, do something different. God often works through people. God is never late, but seldom early. Faith shows itself in action. And last observation, our needs are met as we meet the needs of others. As this widow met the needs of Elijah, her own needs were met. And let's go back and look at the context of the verse we saw a minute ago. The verse we looked at, last part, starting in the word and my God will meet all your needs. And the real sense of it is, if you do this, and then God will do that. And Paul says, I receive full payment and have more than enough. I am amply supplied now that I've received from Epaphroditus the gifts that you sent. You sent me a check, and now God is going to meet your needs. You met my needs, and now God is going to meet your needs. This check was a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice. pleasing to God. And because this has happened, because you gave, my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. This is the magic of the Christian life, that God meets your needs as you seek to meet the needs of others. And may God richly bless you as you discuss these truths together.